On one insanely rainy, overcast day, a young man came to the house of a noble family, and as soon as the maid saw him, she immediately greeted the priest, who had been summoned by the mistress of the house, then called him inside to come through, and it was all about the fact that Duke Blake's family was actually rumored to have a cursed demon that was trapped in a human body. In the end, after a while, they came to the room, and the maid, having warned her mistress that the priest had come to her, and having received permission to enter, began to open the door and let the priest go ahead and asked him to say hello. And in the end, as surprising as it was Mrs. Vanessa Blake who was the demon. At first glance, a crazy bright kid, and even the priest was madly surprised by it. So he looked carefully at the main character and asked how old she was this year. And the maid was surprised by such a question, but calmly explained that the girl was 5 years old. And the problem was that she had never smiled for any reason since she was born. And no matter how many times I talked to her about it, she never reacted. The priest, looking at her insanely serious face, only thought that it was insanely hard to believe that this child was a demon, because it didn't make any sense, and there had definitely been some kind of mistake. So the priest believed that the fact that he was in this house was a sign from the Almighty. After that, he sat closer to Vanessa and smiled. Then he asked the lady to smile, but she only asked her why she should do something like that. After thinking about it for a while, the girl, with the coldest and most unemotional expression on her face, simply told the priest that she was tired of it all, and that she was really annoyed that her family was so worried about her condition. And at that moment, hearing something like this, her mother began to weep bitterly and did not understand what was happening to her daughter and why she was such a child. And it seemed she was really heartbroken. The maids who saw this began to comfort and support her a little so that she could calm down. At that moment, the priest who had been observing the whole scene informed Vanessa Blake's mother that he wanted to go talk to the girl alone for a while. And as soon as they were alone, the young man awkwardly asked Vanessa Blake if she had something she wanted to say but couldn't tell anyone, and asked her to tell him, promising to keep her secret. But Vanessa looked at him calmly and wondered what was the point of telling him anything, because he would never believe her anyway, so it was just a waste of time. The priest only looked shocked at the serious expression on the 5-year-old's face and assured him that he would definitely believe it, so the girl shouldn't worry. And if he told anyone about it, he would be punished by the Almighty because he had sworn to keep it a secret. Vanessa just thought tiredly that this whole situation was boring her insanely much, but after carefully friends, the priest thought that she would just tell him if he wanted to know so badly. And the man himself seemed to look insanely enthusiastic and thought that now she could talk to the girl and solve this problem. But to his great surprise, she began the story of the Scarlet Saint. Then the priest stated that it was the most insane saint who had trashed the whole temple and killed all the saints and even the Pope. And people were saying that after this terrible tragedy, she committed suicide. And this case was quite famous. But then the girl came closer and whispered something to him, after which the priest was shocked and immediately grabbed his cross, which was hanging on his chest, and he was shaking with fear. Then he panicked and said that the child was definitely not in his right mind and was clearly the devil's spawn. And the main character that amusingly watched the whole picture only laughed, which looked quite creepy in connection with the reaction of the priest, and said that from the very beginning he warned him that he would definitely not believe it. Priest, looking at her, still continued to shake with fear and stated that this girl was clearly possessed by demons, and the rumors turned out to be. The mother of the main character tried to stop him to explain what was going on, but the man was so engrossed in his escape that she didn't even notice how he pushed the woman away, causing her to fall to the ground. And the priest didn't even turn around and continued his escape. Vanessa's mother looked at him with tears in her eyes and really didn't know what to do because she thought that only this guy could save her only daughter. But Vanessa wasn't worried because after the priest situation, rumors about her were spreading at the speed of light. And because of that, she felt much safer since no one was touching her. Then she remembered that she had told the priest that the Scarlet Saint was actually her. So the rumors of her being a curse were true, and she could indeed kill the entire entourage. Remembering this, the girl turned to the window and looking at the scenery thought that she really did not lie. After all, she was immortal, and she had already lived 28 lives. She was a saint, a concubine of the king in Argus, suffered from hunger, and was a cook, a slave, and a prisoner, and was even a princess. And every time she was reborn, despite the fact that her personality, parents' circumstances, skills, and appearance changed, she remembered all her lives that were in the past, and yet always remained herself. However, the protagonist was never able to become one with herself from her past life, because when she was reborn in her new life and visited her old parents trying to convince them that she was that very daughter of theirs, they only looked at her in shock with utter disbelief and accused her of being the devil in the flesh, for she could dare to speak the name of their dead daughter. This is the reason why such an intervention always had a terrible end, so I only had to endure all the unbearable longing for my children from past lives and my parents, and also to miss my loved one to the point of madness. Moreover, ending her past life and living thoughtlessly in the present, she was well aware that she was bringing suffering to her present family, but she could not do anything about it, because the problem was her shattered mind from her past life. It was memories like that that tormented her every night. These nightmares ran after her every time and caused Vanessa unbearable pain. So she woke up every time from her own screams and tears, and every time she woke up from such horror, the girl was ready to do anything for the sake of liberation from this hell, because for her new life is another nightmare. But at that moment, while she was still in a nightmare, a voice called out to her, asking if she was the one who had summoned him, and a worried Vanessa Blake, just looking at the wings of the man who had come down from the sky, wondered if it was the devil. In the end, looking at the blonde-haired man in front of her, Vanessa Blake still couldn't believe that in her 29th life, she had met the devil in a dream, because it looked literally unbelievable. After which she stated that at some point she started having nightmares every night. And because of that, she literally couldn't sleep and was afraid to go to sleep, because every time they were disgusting monsters that she couldn't tell anyone about. And in her dreams, the girl callously killed other people one by one with no sense of regret. And when she woke up from this dream, she was shaking with horror and lived with thoughts that tomorrow she would dream something like this again. It was really impossible to bear. So the protagonist ended up thinking about just ending it all together with her life. After rebirth, she would be able to live normally, but she realized that since her soul would remain hers, she would be reborn after death. She had been through it many times, so she knew exactly how it would be. So Vanessa Blake was sure that she would never be able to achieve peace, and that this was the way it was supposed to be. But something changed, and then she looked at the young man who approached her in amazement, wondering if he really wasn't a mere hallucination. But she saw that at the sight of this man, all her nightmares and monsters began to scatter away. At that moment, the man who had been scrutinizing her all this time wondered again if she was the one who had summoned him. And Vanessa Blake just calmly wondered what she was talking about and how she could have summoned him, because it sounded insanely stupid. But at this point, an insanely disgruntled man asked how this child could even behave so dismissively. And he literally could not believe that he had been summoned here by some little girl. But she informed him that she wasn't actually going to summon the devil, and that wasn't her goal. But she calmly pointed to his black wings behind his back and said that if he were an angel, his wings wouldn't be so dark, so it wasn't hard to guess. And the next moment, she looked at him earnestly and asked him what the man had forgotten in her dream. And he, looking at the confident look of a 5-year-old girl, only stated that she was quite bold for her age. But after the man got down on one knee to get a little closer to Vanessa, and she, looking at his face, only confused, didn't understand for what reason this man was so handsome. But at that moment, he spoke to her, inquiring whether the girl was not afraid of him at all. But she, with shaking hands, reported that the young man did not frighten her at all. But this did not go unnoticed by the devil, but he decided to ignore it. Then, turning around at the monsters that were behind Vanessa, asked what they were doing here. After all, they were just low-level demons, and asked the girl what she had done that these monsters were chasing her. And she looked back at these creatures in surprise and wondered if it was all real and not just a nightmare. But the devil only stated that the girl had figured it out quickly enough. Then he grabbed her by the neck and pulled her closer to him, and stated that her scent was strange and insanely pleasant. And at that moment, tears sprang from the protagonist's eyes, and she had a terrible pain in her head, so bad that she thought her head was going to burst, and she just asked the young man to get away from her. But the next moment, he kissed her forehead, and all the pain that had hitherto pierced her whole body began slowly to recede and pass away. But the next moment, she started to sink and was somewhere in an unknown place, and all she realized was that she had to swim to the light that was somewhere far above. So she started to swim to save herself, gasping for air. When she swam out, she began to look around her and realized that the house they were near and the children looked familiar enough, but she still couldn't figure out where exactly she had seen it all. But in the next moment, she noticed the girl that informed her interlocutor that she felt insanely ashamed because of the fact that it was all her own fault, And at that moment, Vanessa Blake realized in shock that this girl was her from her past life, a saint who never lied to anyone or harmed anyone. The protagonist prayed for forgiveness for mistakes made in past lives, occupying her entire life with charity and dedicated herself to God. Then the protagonist was firmly convinced that in this life, the Almighty will pardon and save her. But everything turned out to be not so simple. The next moment, a young man approached her, and then the still maddeningly disgruntled and surprised protagonist asked what he had done to her. But he, with a smile, only informed that he does not even know how it can be properly explained. And most likely, it is a definite reconnaissance. But seeing Vanessa's shocked face, Blake explained that they would only explore her memories. And then the protagonist, excitedly looking around, wondered if it was really just her memories, and they were not transported to the past or to some alternative world. If it was really like that and it was her memories, then now the Pope was sitting across from her past life. The man the protagonist missed unbearably. At that moment, the Pope told the saint across from her that she was probably having nightmares again, and said that if it was difficult for the girl, she could always confide in him and tell him. And she embarrassedly thanked the Holy Father for such a thing. The main character, who was watching all this, just began to cry from helplessness, because she could not imagine that she saw the Pope again. After all, it was an insanely important person in her life, because he was the only person who understood her suffering and became a support for her. So she continued to fight her difficulties and not give up. But even though she had the Pope by her side, and despite her pure, strong faith in God, she still wasn't saved, because that was the day a girl killed the Pope. And the reason was because she had a history of sleepwalking. And so presently, the girl rose to her feet, while an agitated Vanessa Blake tried to block her way and shouted that she couldn't let her go there and she must wake up immediately. But since it was just a memory, she was like a ghost to their reality. So the saint just walked through her, and not even the fabric on her clothes moved. And the protagonist kept screaming for her to stop and stop as soon as possible. At that moment, the devil approached her and told Vanessa that she could not change anything, because most likely the protagonist had already guessed everything. After that, he scrutinized Vanessa and told her that what they were doing was just an observation in her memories, nothing more. And at that moment, listening to the words of the devil, the girl admitted that it took her several years to forget all this horror, and was this man really offering her to silently watch all this? And she just could not accept it. But at that moment, the saint approached a knight, who gave her a maddeningly awkward look and wondered what she was doing here at this late hour. And in the meantime, Vanessa Blake, who was standing behind them, just shouted for that man to run away as soon as possible, because it was about to start. In the next moment, the saint, drawing the sword that belonged to this knight, took his life with a simple sweep of her hand. After all, this man did not even suspect that he could expect danger from this girl. The next moment, the Pope approached the saint, surrounded by knights and other clergymen. And he looked at the saint anxiously and worriedly and asked what she was doing. And the other knights and saints around began to shout that the Pope had to leave and hide, for it was insanely dangerous here, for their saint had killed their knight. Then, looking at the saint, who stood calmly looking at her reflection in the blade, the knights were ordered to detain her as soon as possible. But the reason was that the reflection in the girl's blade was not hers at all, and everything looked like a blur to her now. Then the battle began, and Vanessa, shaking with fear and shock, watched as she from her past life mercilessly and easily killed all the knights that were protecting the Pope, and also heard their cries, which were not begging for mercy, but were filled with despair. And all Vanessa could ask for was for it to finally stop, but it didn't. In the end, when there was no knight left, the protagonist from her past life became over the Pope. And at that moment, the protagonist desperately asked herself to stop. But of course, the saint did not listen to her and brought her sword over the young man's head. But he only looked at her with a kind of humility, as if even if he could have fought, he would not have done so anyway. And calmly closing his eyes, allowed the saint to do his plan, so he lost his life. And then the girl, in shock again, watching the same picture, realized that it was from that day she stopped believing in God and was nicknamed the Scarlet Saint. But it all started long before that, in her life before that, when she was a knight and a member of a group of assassins. In that life, the girl had no hope or will in life, because she was brainwashed, and her goal then was only to destroy the temple. And until her death, she ruthlessly killed everyone in her path. And in her next life, she remained a saint in the temple and persevered in penance for all her sins she had committed when she was a knight. But eventually, after all that happened to the Pope, the saint came to her senses and saw the cruel sight before her, and she just couldn't live with it, and went mad, and took her own life. But at that moment, the devil that was looking at the madly crying and literally morally destroyed girl decisively turned and reported that everything he had seen was really wonderful. Then it told the girl that it was the first time he'd had so much fun in a long time. But she just gasped and cried and called the guy a demonic asshole and wondered what he'd done to her and vowed to kill him. But then she weakened and lay down on the ground. But the man only said that in that case, he would take her comments as a compliment. And then he began to count and stated that it was her 29th life, and she had an immortal soul. After which, approaching the girl and placing his hand on her head, stroked her hair and informed her that it didn't matter anyway, as he was well satiated with her emotions, and so he rewarded the girl for it. Then leaning over her, he told Vanessa that as a reward, he would make sure that she would not have nightmares for a month, and that she would now be able to sleep peacefully. And the girl was shocked. Looking at him, she didn't understand what he was talking about, because all she wanted was for the man to finally leave her dream. And he did so, and before smiling affectionately at her, he wished her sweet dreams and then disappeared. And finally, everything was covered with a bright white glow, and when the protagonist opened her eyes, she found that she was in her room, and everything was fine. Then, analyzing everything that happened, she still did not understand what happened and stated that she must have fallen asleep. Then she had nightmares, and the devil came. After a while, she just kind of lost consciousness. But at that moment, a maid came up to her and excitedly asked if Vanessa Blake was awake, because she'd been asleep for an insanely long time, which was very unlike her, because she usually sleeps quite lightly and often wakes up. But today was the first time she'd slept so long and soundly, and that only excited looking at her maid literally could not believe what the girl said. Because in Vanessa's body, the main character has never slept normally, but today slept until lunch. After that, she got up from her seat and concentrated on her inner sensations and realized that her body didn't ache, and although it was surprising, she didn't have a headache and didn't know what had happened. But then she remembered the young man and that he had promised to take away her nightmares for a month. And then she realized that apparently whatever it was for her, surprisingly, what the guy said was true, and he did take away her nightmares. At that moment, the protagonist happily embraced her maid and smiled sincerely and said that she had finally had no hallucinations. And so every morning after a good night's sleep, the protagonist was greeted by bright sunshine. And every morning her attitude towards the devil changed for the better. All people said that the devil brings destruction and other misfortunes, but for her, he became a savior. And also her heart stopped hurting when she remembered the Pope. So she realized that the devil must have deliberately entered her mind and cured her painful memories. But then she began to remember that the devil had given her only 1 month to live without these nightmares. So she knew that while this month was still not over, she must definitely meet the young man again. But despite her desire, the devil did not appear in her dreams, and time went on as usual. And she had not been able to meet the devil, and as a result, now the girl was standing in the laboratory and reading a book, preparing a potion, in which it was necessary to grind 6 worms to dust, add to the resulting mass of chicken blood, and then lay out of all the prepared ingredients a magic circle. The main character did so, having thrown everything necessary into the cauldron, began to stir it all slowly and cook to the necessary state. But the next moment, the cauldron in which she cooked it all just exploded. And then Vanessa Blake turned her back and stated that she had failed again, and she didn't even remember which attempt it was. Then she confessed that earlier she had hoped that at least this time she would succeed, and looked at her book and spell and couldn't understand where she had gone wrong. It was in such attempts to contact the devil that she turned 19 years old. 600 years ago, one nameless church that held to patriarchy disapproved of witches having powers and declared that they were cursed beings. As a result of this statement, witches were hunted everywhere, and the blood of innocent girls was spilled. Later, it turned out that this statement was malicious and the status of witches was restored. By then, however, all the witches had been killed and destroyed. But the problem was magic and genetics, because the witch race had been eradicated, so no new mages were born. So there are only a few mages left at the moment, such as those who belong to the Imperial Tower of Mages. And those who are left have great power and strength. So it takes a huge amount of money to get the help of such magicians. But in general, Vanessa Blake didn't need their help because in one of her lives, she was a witch who had reached the highest level of magic, so she could handle it alone. And now, sitting in front of the drawn pentagram, the girl turned to the devil and said that she was ready to devote herself to him and asked him to make a contract with her. After that, she stated that the spell to summon the devil was not difficult at all, but despite her attempts and efforts, the devil did not appear. So again, waiting for his appearance, Vanessa Blake sadly stated that these attempts had no sense at all, and it seems that the devil's jerk was somewhere far away, so he did not appear. Whereupon she stated that during her research, she had learned 4 things. First, that devils live in hell. Secondly, like humans, they have class distinctions. Third, the devil's main source of nourishment is the negative energy of people. And fourthly, the devils love contracts on which men stake their souls. So it could easily be said that such was the only amusement in their immortal life. And there are many other records of the devils besides. A little later at a tea party, the excited noblewoman sat and talked, discussing whether they had heard the rumor about the Mad Duke. And then she girl reported that this Duke Isaac might attack their kingdom of Victoria. And another girl reported that there are rumors that 10 kingdoms have become colonies of the empire of that Duke. And they also say that he was possessed by demons, and this world was becoming scarier and scarier. At this meeting also participated, and the protagonists some attentively listened to them drinking their tea and just quietly thinking about everything said. After that, she said that all the girls talked about it too easily and lowered her gaze and stated that the slightest rudeness and a person automatically became possessed by a devil or a demon. If the devil could appear so easily, she would not have agonized over it, but after excitedly apologized for saying it. But at that moment, she of the girls smiled and said that everything was fine since it was the first time Vanessa was so strongly interested in something. But the protagonist calmly explained that no one knows and perhaps their kingdom really threatened a huge danger. But the girl said that most likely their kingdom Victoria will not fall so easily, as they had the most advanced and powerful military force. Then the main character got up from her seat and thought about what she had forgotten in the midst of these girls, because it was very difficult for her to fit in with the others. She knew it was rude to leave in the middle of a tea party, but no one could say a word to her about her behavior. After all, she had her own special image, alienated from society, uninterested in marriage, a mysterious and inaccessible lady. And then when the girl left, the other aristocrats wondered what it would be like to look at the Duke's daughter. She was insanely bright, and this was immediately apparent in the way the protagonist communicated. And the other girl only awkwardly agreed. In the end, the protagonist awkwardly exhaled, awkwardly wondering could Duke Isaac really be possessed by a demon. Then realized that she had just been invited to go to this tea party, so she came. But she didn't know that she would come and listen to such silly gossip, because it was definitely not the devil, since he has no reason to live in the human world. But if he was really here, she would want to meet him again, for though he was the devil, he was the only one who knew her real one and who had helped her even in spite of her past. While standing over the dead body of a young man who was completely bloody was his father the king and his sister the princess. And the guy who did this to the prince said it emphatically that the mere word hair makes me sick. But the next moment, the man with tears and fear in his eyes asked that the Duke at least have mercy on the princess and ordered his daughter to bow to his highness now, for that was the only way she could survive. But the guy only smilingly reported that the way the man tried to save his daughter was a pathetic enough sight. But apparently he hadn't heard about the rumors that were about him, before adding with a smile that every one of his new brides dies after their first wedding night. And then the girl, being in hysterics, screamed at the young man and said that he was a devil's spawn and she didn't need his help. Then she said that he would definitely fall under the ground, and the Almighty would surely punish him. But the man reacted coldly enough and simply gestured to his knight to deal with it. And the next moment, the girl's bloody body was already lying on the floor. The king called her name excitedly, trying to rouse her, and still could not believe that he had so easily lost his son as well as his daughter. The young man who was the devil watched with some curiosity, absorbing the man's negative emotions. Then he realized that he was really a lowlife. He wanted more thrills, like the little girl from the past had given him. Then when it closer to the king, the guy took his crown and said that as far as he knew, there were quite a few beauties in the kingdom of Victoria, and he needed to find a pair for each of his knights. Then, putting the crown on his subordinate, informed the king to inform all the noble families, and invited the unmarried noble ladies to join the procession and return to the empire. Eventually, at that moment, a messenger with a letter immediately burst into the main character's house and informed the Duke that a terrible thing had happened, and their palace had been invaded. And it was Duke Isaac. Heard about it, the protagonist immediately wondered whether it was the same Duke Isaac, who was also called the Devil, and from the rumors of this guy was considered the most terrible of all men. At this time, his subordinates, and who rode after him on horseback, were discussing how necessary it was to kill the king's daughter and also to kidnap women, but the white-haired man wondered why this guy was starting such a conversation again. It was much worse than the old days, but the disgruntled man only asked if their Duke Isaac was really going to search for all the women on the continent. But then his interlocutor thought that apparently Duke Isaac was only looking for someone in particular. And the man himself began to remember how it had happened that he had been planted in this body. One day he noticed an insanely emaciated man who was very seriously wounded and was on the verge of death. But then he just stumbled and fell down exhaustedly because his body had too little strength to resist. And then he was noticed by the devil, who bent down and looked at the young man and stated that his body, which still had a perfect life, suited him. So he decided to stop on it. Eventually, the royal palace of Victoria was destroyed, and the king was taken prisoner, and the crown prince and even the princess were killed, and things got out of control. The protagonist watched excitedly as her father read the letter that said it all, and waited for him to comment on it in some way. But he just kept silent in horror without finding the strength to respond. Then the protagonist turned to Stella and wondered if she could tell her what had happened. She had to know what to prepare for. But at this moment, shocking the girl, Stella informed that all unmarried girls from noble families are taken to the Empire. And also, if at the feast within 3 days the Duke cannot find a bride, he will exterminate the entire clan of girls. Everyone was terrified and didn't know what to do. And my mom and brother just stood there, knowing full well that they were being forced to lose their daughter and sister. And they were asking Vanessa Blake what to do. But she realized that if she didn't marry this man, her whole family would be destroyed. Then she thought that if she were an ordinary noble daughter from a noble family, the situation would be very humiliating for her. And after recalling the past, she mentally stated that she was once a slave who was treated worse than cattle. So for her, there was nothing unbelievable about this attitude. But at the next moment, her brother approached her that tenderly embraced her and crying said that he did not want to let his sister go anywhere and was not ready to say goodbye to her. And Vanessa seems madly not expected such behavior. And at that moment, her brother said that his sister would definitely be bullied. And there was no sense in such a case to keep their social status. It was better to run away together somewhere at night. At that moment, the girl calmly looked at her brother and said that she had heard that Duke Isaac was a very radical man. And even if she ran away, he would not leave their family in peace, and informed that he just can't let her go. At that moment, their mother and father approached them, and the woman said in tears that if they had known something like this would happen, they would have married her off as her older sister and apologized sincerely for what had happened. But Vanessa Blake calmed them down and told them not to apologize, because she was the one who turned down all the marriage proposals. Then smiling and still hugging her brother, who was crying so earnestly and fearing for her life, she said that I should have been worried too, because as long as she was there, their family would be safe. So they could just trust her and wait a bit. At this time, the maids who heard all this perfectly began to speculate about it, and then one of them wondered whether their mistress will really be all right. After all, people in that empire were like savages. So they were madly sorry for the main character. The next day, the girl dutifully packed her things in her suitcase and realized that already tomorrow she would be leaving. So there was no point in delaying. Then lastly, she cast a spell that hid her potion room and thought that this was the place she had previously created to summon the devil, but just in case she should get rid of it. Because if anyone found out, her family would be recognized as heretics, and that would put their lives in danger. But then she looked around her room and wondered if that would be enough. Then she realized that she wasn't even worried or scared about the situation, because she was sure that wherever she went, she'd be alive. And after sitting on the bed and looking at her packed bags, she thought that earlier she had thought that in this life she would be able to live as a normal person. But in the end, it turned out quite differently. Then the girl stated that her name was Vanessa in this life, and she even liked her name. She was also the second daughter of a duke who never needed anything. She had a family that loved her madly and cherished her so everything was really perfect. After that, I remembered that Smiling Man Devil stated that I could even meet him, but to meet the devil again seems to be really impossible. Eventually, that night her parents, along with her brothers, slept with her, and then while her younger brother and father had already fallen asleep, her mother turned to the girl and asked if she remembered how she had absolutely no smile as a child, because they were so sad because they didn't know how to make her happy. But on her 5th birthday, she smiled and greeted them with joy for the first time. And then they thought it really wasn't unbelievable, and they were over the moon because their beloved daughter could finally be happy. And that was the most important thing for the parents. Afterwards, the mother told Vanessa that she was their most precious treasure. And then the protagonist only stated that she had started to pretend to be a good child. She realized how selfish she had been and how much pain she had caused them. And then her mother, with tears in her eyes, turned to her beloved daughter and asked her to take care of herself. And that's when Vanessa realized that she had parents who had been worried sick about her all this time, and her little brother who was insanely caring. And then there was an older sister. So for this family, she was willing to sacrifice herself. In the end, when the main character's younger brother woke up in the morning, he noticed that there was no one around. So he started to look around in shock and didn't understand where the girl had disappeared to. Then, looking out the window, I saw the main character standing by the carriage and saying goodbye to her parents and getting ready to leave. And then her brother shouted with all his might to his sister not to leave yet and to wait for him. Then he started running down the long stairs and corridors, but in the end he didn't make it in time and her carriage had already left. So his parents held him down and reiterated that everything would be all right. But the boy was very worried, both because he didn't have time to say goodbye and because the girl had left. And the protagonist who rode in the carriage only sadly mentally said goodbye to her family. Eventually, so she sent on the road with all together. Other ladies and knights. They traveled nonstop for over a month. And the more they traveled, the harder it became for them, because they were in terrible conditions, and they were watched every hour, and not even allowed to wash. And the food was hard to even call food, so there were maggots, and all the girls didn't understand how something like that could be eaten. But the knights calmly reported that no one forced them to eat, and if they did not want to, they could not do it. It was from this moment it became obvious that the nobility of the knights did not extend to the ladies who traveled and from the ruined state. They were treated quite roughly, which made them cry bitterly every night. And there were even some who got sick and died because no one treated them. In the end, the protagonist had another nightmare, but she was awakened by the voice of one of the knights that loudly announced to everyone that they had arrived in the Empire. And then the excited girl immediately looked out of her window and found that in front of them was a huge palace of insane beauty, surrounded by high walls, columns, and towers. And so after several centuries, the girl came back to this place again, and then stated that this empire of Alberich had become much more beautiful than the last time she was here. In the end, the knights stopped and made a halt and then began to look at the girls they had brought and wondered which of all these ladies was the most beautiful girl. But then the knight calmly said that there was no point in beauty if these girls couldn't say a word in their language even after a month. But the other knight only told his colleague that Eric was a real bore. After all, what kind of language training could we talk about if no one paid attention to them? But Eric calmly informed that Duke Isaac had ordered to return to the Empire as soon as possible, and there was no time for any training. Then asked that his colleague inform these fools that they were on a break. And then the knight approached the girls and said that since today they were celebrating the day when their ancestors entered the land of the Empire, they were allowed to rest and wash today. And the indignant girl only wondered, did they really have to wash right in front of them? But the knight indignantly remarked that the ladies were allowed to wash, and they didn't like it. But the other knights said they could do whatever they wanted, and he shouldn't have minded. In the end, the protagonist took the opportunity to go and stripped down to her underwear and began to rinse her body, and thought that she does not remember when she last washed. But then she heard some talking knights, so turning around, she looked carefully in their direction to listen. And then a man said that the Duke's expression and behavior seemed to have changed. Another knight said that if you compare it to how Duke Isaac was a couple of years ago, it seems that his character has changed, because he used to be nice and polite. Then they started discussing that Duke Isaac was probably just pretending. After all, they were in a struggle for the throne. And if the Duke was caught by anyone at that moment, he wouldn't be left alive. And after that incident, he became the supreme commander of the Celestial Knights group. And this proves that he originally had a strong temperament. But then if they began to discuss whether their Duke had become too cruel, for he enjoyed killing and conquest, and did so without any purpose. And Vanessa, who was listening to all this, wondered if he was only doing this to them for fun, and if the rumors that he was the devil were true. And then she thought that even though there was no guarantee that Duke Isaac was the devil she was looking for, it seemed to her that there was still a chance of meeting him. But after she crossed her eyes with the knight Eric, and then he immediately suspected that apparently this girl understood the imperial language, but thought that he probably still imagined it, and so calmed down and continued to talk to the knights. Eventually, they all arrived at the Empire, and then the knights ordered the girls who had come from Victoria to line up one behind the other and follow the servants who would lead them to their rooms. But one of the maids smugly announced that she was madly annoyed with the ladies. After all, they didn't understand them anyway. After all, they had been told earlier to stand behind each other, and they stood up as they wished. The protagonist watched it all with attention and thought that this maid was insanely arrogant and should have been memorized, but so far decided not to show that she understood their language. In the end, the next moment they were all brought into a room where instead of a bed, the blankets and pillows were just thrown together in a pile. And then Vanessa Blake looked around at the whole thing and simply stated that it was a huge mess, but then wondered if she should have thanked them for at least giving her a blanket. The next moment they were addressed by one of the maids, who said that if they had already looked around, they should gather around them, for they were about to call their names. And as soon as they heard their name, they should raise their heads. After that, she began to call out one by one, and when the turn came to Vanessa, the second daughter of Duke Blake, the main character raised her hand. And the other girls admiringly did not believe that she was the rumored daughter of the Duke. In fact, many did not even suspect it while they were traveling together. Finally, the maid, closing her book listing their names, announced that roll call was over, and they were to move on to the next item. Then informed them that, as the girls already knew, a great celebration begins today in their empire, and so His Highness has graciously provided them with the necessities to prepare for the festivities. After that, the maids gave them jewelry and clothes and told them that each of the girls could choose whatever she liked, as the clothes, accessories, and everything they needed were already there. Then they said that they would leave them there. When the maids left, one disgruntled lady said that it was really ignorant, and another excitedly added that in such a situation, it was rather stupid to prepare for the gala, and apparently they were just going to be used now. Then they started to plan what they were going to do, and one of them stated that they had to survive first. The next moment, the girl who had separated from the group started to look around for a familiar face. After that, she noticed Vanessa and happily ran up to her, and the protagonist, in shock, did not understand what Princess Seraphima forgot here. But she only smiled and said that when she heard the name of the protagonist, she immediately began to look for her. She was worried that something might have happened to her, but now that she saw that the girl was fine, she was overjoyed. And the protagonist was shocked and didn't understand why the girl was so worried about her. She would have been better off worrying about herself. The next moment, Seraphima asked if the main character would like to choose some outfit with her. After all, they would be together with their potential husbands, so they should have dressed up. But Vanessa Blake calmly remarked that she thought it was too late to choose, and then stated that even though the others pretend not to care, they actually see each of them as competition, and there are probably no good dresses left. But then she noticed one of the outfits and asked if Seraphima could see the green dress that was hanging in the distance, and said that it was a dress that would fit her like crazy. So she advised her to hurry up and get it while she could, and that only without me awkwardly thanking the protagonist asked the reason why she thought this dress would suit her. But Vanessa calmly informed that Seraphima has a very attractive and calm aura, and the muted green color will accentuate her elegance. And since she had a petite upper body and a more rounded lower body, this dress would emphasize her advantages well and hide her disadvantages. So no other dress could fit her as perfectly as this one. And then the girl, approached to state that the protagonist was indeed right in addition, remained exactly her size, and wondered how the protagonist was able to guess it so clearly. And Vanessa Blake only him awkwardly exhaled because it was also related to her past life. Because in one of her past lives, she was a famous fashion designer, and at that time, she was approached by ladies from the upper classes to get her outfits. In the end, the main character that was opposite the madly joyful girl thought that she should also look for a dress, so she had to go and choose. Meanwhile, the other girls looked on in admiration and did not understand what had just happened. But then they awkwardly approached Vanessa and asked if she had a moment to advise them as well. Vanessa awkwardly exhaled and said that it wasn't a problem. And for the next few minutes, she was surrounded by an insane amount of girls who kept asking her to help them too. And she just awkwardly thought that she didn't like that at all, because she didn't like being the center of attention. In the end, after a while, the main character helped everyone who wanted to help, and those insanely praised her talents and said that they madly like it. And she really had an eye diamond, because she was able to literally, in a couple of seconds, to pick up a suitable dress. At this time, Seraphima stated that Vanessa Blake has done a great job, but still did not choose anything for herself. And she only weary said that she would explore something to go look for. Then I went to one of the dresses. Looking at it, I thought that it should fit. Then I tried it on, and then madly admiring Seraphima, stated that Vanessa Blake looked insanely beautiful in this dress. And other girls shocked, looking at it surprised, did they really not notice such an outfit? And then said that the rumors that Vanessa Blake was insanely beautiful turned out to be really true, because it was already possible to predict exactly who will be the main character at today's celebration, because this place will definitely be occupied by Duchess Vanessa. In the end, all the girls quickly decided on their outfits, and then the maid said that if they were all done dressing up, they should hurry up and go to the banquet hall. After that, each of them wondered why they had to hurry, because apparently Duke Isaac had probably arrived earlier than expected. At that moment, the main character followed them and wondered if Duke Isaac would be with them from the very first day. She didn't think she would meet him so soon. Then she wondered what kind of man he was. But then at some point, her whole body began to shake with fear, and she didn't understand what it was connected with, because it felt like her whole body was paralyzed. At this time, outside the palace, joyful people announced that His Highness Duke Isaka had arrived, and the delighted residents cheered madly at his arrival. And the protagonist literally froze with fear. It was at this time that Her Majesty the Empress was informed that His Highness Duke Isaac had arrived, and so if she wanted to see the young man, she should hurry. And then she put in the last touches in her makeup and looked around herself and fearfully announced that she was ready. But at that moment, her look was insanely frightening, and the atmosphere around seemed very eerie. Eventually, at the next moment, a woman came up to the lad a little in a hurry, and then it was announced that Her Majesty the Empress had arrived, whereupon she called joyfully to the Duke and wished him a happy holiday and told him that the young man was the pride of the whole Alberich Empire, for he had been away for a long time, and they were all worried that something might have happened to him, and she was especially worried. After which she reported with a smile that the man, on the contrary, looked very solid and manly. At this time, one of the knights only grudgingly reflected that their emperor had been tormented by illness for 5 years, and the Empress had already taken an interest in the Duke. Then, looking him over carefully, he reflected that if the attempt on the Duke's life had been successful then, there was no chance that the Empress would be interested in him now. But the next moment, seeing his frightening look of red eyes, he immediately shook with fear, because madly such a thing was not expected. Then stated that this man was quite frightening, and it was as if he read his mind. But at that moment, the man looked at the crown prince with a smile, instead of answering the Empress, and said that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. But as he saw, the boy did not miss his uncle at all, and he just excitedly, shaking with fear, said that it wasn't like that at all, and he was happy to see his uncle, and he just thanked him. Then, coming close and touching his shoulder, he said he missed him terribly and hoped the boy knew how much he treasured his nephew and how much he relied on him, for he was his dearest member of the family. Finally, seeing the fear of the last prince, the devil began to absorb his emotion, namely fear, and calmly inquired if the celebration had already begun. Eventually, by this point, the music was already playing and the visiting girls were dancing around with the local knights in a slow dance. And at this time, the protagonist was standing quietly and talking along with Serafina, and the latter was only excited looking at her friend, wondered if everything was definitely okay with Vanessa, for she looked like she wasn't feeling well. But the protagonist, smiling awkwardly, reported that everything was really fine and she needn't have worried, though she still wondered why I was so paralyzed at that moment. Then she stated that even though everything was fine now, she was still uneasy about what had happened, because her main goal today was to meet the Duke and see if he was the right devil or not. But as the girl reached for dessert to distract herself from thinking, she was approached by another lady who told Vanessa that she had heard a lot of rumors about her and was glad to finally meet her. The protagonist was just thinking that she had enough of this girl. At this point, the approaching looking at Vanessa wondered if she didn't know her. She was the daughter of Duke Logan, and she was the most beautiful girl in their empire until her title passed to the protagonist. After the protagonist became the most beautiful girl in the empire, she began to receive countless invitations to parties from the Logan family. And so Vanessa Blake assumed that they were not inviting her with the best intentions, and so she said she was sick and always refused. Vanessa Blake looked at the girl in front of her and said that she knew her well. She was the daughter of the Duke of Logan, and wondered if the girl had anything to say to her. But she calmly said that she had not planned to make any specific conversation, and that it was just surprising to her that the girl felt perfectly well here, though constantly sick in the Kingdom of Victoria. But the protagonist calmly said that she had recently recovered, so she didn't understand why this girl was now interested in something like that. But she looked at the protagonist and wondered what the protagonist was so unhappy about. It was written all over her face. She had to try a little harder if she wanted to maintain her status as Duke of Blake. And then looking at Vanessa, she wondered if she got so arrogant because she wanted to find a fiancé here. And Vanessa Blake only wondered what this girl was trying to achieve by such a circus and this behavior, because her nagging did not bother the main character at all. For in past lives, she had constantly encountered such things in the days when she was a countess. And the girl had to be the center of attention at her husband's festivities, and she didn't know how she could stand all the slanted glances and jeers in her direction. Then she stated that if she had verbally fought with all the envious people, she would have had to break her voice. And she knew perfectly well that there was nothing good in such a fight, but realized that it would be a good idea to teach this girl a lesson. At this time, she smiled slyly and looking at Vanessa told her not to worry. For now in this place where they would be chosen, no one would choose her. But at this point, the protagonist stopped her and grudgingly informed her that everything this girl had said before and after the phrase that they would be chosen sounded very bad. And if she wasn't chosen by the knight, she would go and choose him herself. For however much this girl might try to hurry, marriage between lovers is for life. And she did not think that caution in such a matter was to be mocked. Then the protagonist, turning around, realized that she literally felt with her whole body that in their direction began to look. And so thanked the lady for her concern and asked her not to disturb her anymore and not to be interested in her identity. Then reminded her that she had previously said such words as untalented and unremarkable knights, and informed her that this girl should not have assumed that all knights in the empire did not know their language. And she only indignantly tried to yell at Vanessa. But she calmly stopped her and told her that it would be better for the lady if she ended it, and would not continue this kindergarten because she looked very humiliating. Then she looked at her seriously and said that if she ever found out that this girl had spoken badly about her or her family behind her back again, she wouldn't let it go. And when the aristocrats saw such a sinister aura around the protagonist, they immediately started to look at each other awkwardly and then immediately left, realizing that it's not worth it. And at that moment, Seraphima approached Vanessa and said that the girl is really crazy cool. But at that moment, His Highness the Duke entered the room, and then the protagonist excitedly stood for a while without even daring to turn towards him. But when she turned around, she immediately noticed the young man and literally could not believe that he was the Duke. Then she stated that as soon as she saw the young man, she knew he was definitely the devil because she could see it in his eyes. One of those secrets was that the greater the power, the more structurally individual it is, and power can be manifested not only in physical and magical skills, but also in appearance. When powers reach a high level, they allow to learn about the abilities of another person, and therefore, the more capable and strong a person, the more he attracts the attention of other people. At this time, the excited girls watching this Duke Isaac and literally were surprised, for they did not believe that they would be able to see the commander-in-chief of the Celestial Knights in person, and they thought that he would come at the very last moment. But the disgruntled Eric who was watching them only wondered why they were standing there looking at him instead of bowing their heads. At this point, His Highness's aides reported that their Duke Isaac would not be here for long, so they should not have focused their attention on him. This event is dedicated to the memory and gratitude of those who served in the war, and they hope that everyone will have a good rest and find brides. But at that moment, the Duke's attention was attracted by the main heroine, and then he smilingly looked at her and said that this girl has incredible power. She wondered if Duke Isaki could really sense her power. Then there was a possibility that he might be the devil, so she had to get even closer to make sure. But she noticed that there were guards on either side of the young man who were weaker, so they weren't likely to do anything to her. And farther back was a man who looked strong, but like the previous two would still be weaker than her. And it turns out no one would get in her way. But in the next moment, as soon as she made a step towards the Duke, then to her neck was immediately pointed a weapon, and the knights accused the protagonist of rudeness and told her not to dare to approach and quickly moved away. But at that moment, the amazed Isaac, who looked into the eyes of the main character, immediately saw the resemblance to that little girl and literally could not believe that he could meet her. And at that moment, see his stunned look, Vanessa Blake immediately realized that he also recognized her. So she bowed to His Highness and asked if she could ask him to dance. But he just laughed for a while, not understanding what was going on. After which he admitted with a smile that it was really incredible and very interesting turn of events, and he even liked it, and gladly agreed to the dance. After that, he reached out and pulled her closer to him. Then with a smile looking at her face, he asked her what she was going to do next. And the girl said with a smile that now she was going to pretend to fall in love with the young man at first sight. Eventually, during the dance, Vanessa found them dancing to the rhythm of the beautiful music. The Lady of the Fallen Kingdom and Duke Isaac of the Victorious Empire. And it was insanely ironic. But there was something that no one here knew about it. Namely, that they were hiding a huge secret. At which point the Duke stated that Vanessa was a very good dancer. And was it because she had learned it in one of her past lives? But she calmly and coldly looking at the young man stated that he also moved quite skillfully, and inquired did all devils really dance so well. But he only smiled and pulled the girl closer to him, and said that he didn't know the exact answer, but he was more than sure that not all devils were that good. Vanessa Blakely thinking about how long she had been waiting for this moment, and if she missed it, she would definitely never see this man again. So she needed to get his favor anyway. And then Vanessa Blake said she knew the gentleman was always hungry, and she knew she was special to him, and then came close to his face and told him that together they could be great partners, and she would be a toy that could brighten his dull days, so he wouldn't regret it. Then she thought that in one of her lives she had been the emperor's mistress. So she knew how to gain favor and please the nobles, and so flawless appearance and luxurious dress were a small part of what could attract them. But she knew she had to take it to the next level to win her favor. But at that moment, the sight of her shaking her face in spite of her impertinent phrases, the man approached and said that she was still as bold as when she was a child, and absolutely nothing had changed, and told the girl to come back here in 2 days. And then he passed by and walked away from the hall. And then as shaking Vanessa realized she only had 3 days and she had to do anything to get this man to agree with her. And then stated that, as she suspected, Duke Isaac was in fact the devil. And he wasn't just any devil. He was her devil. In the end, in the next moment, as soon as everyone had already calmed down, Seraphima came to the protagonist and excitedly took her by the hand and asked what the girl was up to. After all, Duke Isaac had ceased their state, and had the girl forgotten about it. But she calmly asked how it was possible to forget about such a thing, and then Seraphima said that moreover, if they could not marry, this man could deprive their families of their titles, and there were rumors that the man was the devil, and Vanessa was just dancing with him. So now no private knight would be able to get near her. But Vanessa Blake calmly reported that everything was really fine, and asked the girl why she was so worried about her. And she only asked indignantly, how could anyone not worry in a situation like this? But after Vanessa Blake saw her frightened face, she smiled and told the girl that she really didn't have to worry because His Highness was interested in her. And so she thought that, on the contrary, his interest in her would increase. After which she wondered if she thought the knights would be uncomfortable and not want to get close to her, and added with a smile that even in such a case, she herself would make the first step towards them, and therefore believed that there were no knights here so self-confident who would have the courage to refuse her. And then Seraphima shook and said that it was not what she meant, and the protagonist only realized that she knew that it was not what the princess wanted to say. She was talking about Duke Isaac being an enemy of their homeland. Then the maddeningly uncertain girl reported that Duke Isaac had killed many people, killed all the knights and all the servants who lived and defended their kingdom, and even killed their princess and prince. Then turned away and said that of course Vanessa Blake had the right to do what she thought was right, because she was always right. But at that moment, the protagonist calmly looked her over and said that the princess should have realized that they were literally being held here as prisoners. But if at least one girl in the middle had strength and power, attitudes would change dramatically. After which she told the girl that she didn't know if she could become such a protector, but at the very least she was willing to try. In the end, alone with herself, Vanessa realized that everything she had said to Seraphima had been a lie and hypocrisy, even though the princess was right. But after the main character thought that now she really wants to get close to this duke, because she has long forgotten what patriotism means, because of being reborn in a new country every time. But then the protagonist noticed a maid who bowed to the knight and the lady next to him. Then Vanessa Blake immediately remembered that it was the same arrogant maid. So suspecting her closer, I wondered if she could come closer. And she only awkwardly wondered if the protagonist had anything to say to her. Then wondered when this girl had managed to learn their language. At this point, Vanessa Blake looked around her, calmly asked if there were any servants here besides this girl, and she bent down and told a mistress that she was being insanely formal with her, and asked the protagonist to address her more informally. But she calmly explained that now the girl was also being polite to her. Although she had expressed herself in a similar manner yesterday, but she only shouted excitedly and reported that she did not know that there was someone among them who knew their language. And at this point, Vanessa wondered what difference it made whether someone knew the language or not. After all, wasn't there a rule in the Empire that you could be rude to people who didn't know the imperial language? The girl only stammered in embarrassment and said that it was really her mistake, and she was terribly sorry. And Vanessa Blake calmly said that she didn't need to apologize to her. After all, you should apologize to all the girls as well. Although she wasn't sure if they would forgive her. But at that moment, the maid awkwardly noticed that even if she apologized, the other ladies would not even understand a word. And the main character already absolutely did not listen to her because she paid attention to the fact that around became too noisy. And then she noticed that an older maid had appeared in front of her, and rising from her seat, she realized that they had the same uniform. And perhaps the maid was the daughter of the head maid. And now I see why she was so rude. But the next moment, a senior maid approached her and excitedly inquired on what occasion the mistress was holding a conversation with her subordinate. And she calmly explained that there had been talk earlier that even though they came from the fallen state, it didn't mean they could be rude to them, and wondered if the Empire no longer suspended maids who disregarded the rules. But the woman only looked at her fearfully and asked how the protagonist knew about it, and the girl did not answer, but thought that she knew it from one of her past lives when she was a servant of this empire. And then in all seriousness told the woman that she had a suspicion that His Majesty approved of the rudeness of visiting girls. But the maid only wondered if the protagonist had meant it. But then the woman realized that it was probably the lady who had recently danced with His Highness. So she looked closely at Vanessa and said that it was not so, and that His Highness had ordered that the young lady should be welcomed and cared for. And if so, she wondered whether in such a case the maid had acted in such a way because of her neglect, and if so, she should be punished. At this moment, the woman bowed apologized to the mistress and said that she would definitely scold this maid for her rude treatment, and asked that the girl have mercy and accept her sincere apology. Then she promised that they would provide the best rooms for the visiting girls from the Kingdom of Victoria, increase the number of servants, and that this woman would personally see to it that all these servants treated her properly. And then the protagonist agreed and turned her gaze to the guilty maid and asked her what her name was. Her name was Amy. And then the protagonist looked at her carefully and said that she had already remembered her, and then went on down the corridors. And then the head maid realized that not only had this girl already won the Duke's favor, she was also now publicly in charge of the palace servants. So she was clearly an unusual person. Then she thought that there was still no one to take the place of the Duchess, and perhaps it would be this lady who would take her place. Eventually, after that very day, the Victoria ladies' attitudes changed dramatically, and their rooms were very luxurious. The food was also of a high standard as befitted ladies of their position. And moreover, the girls were provided with new dresses and accessories. Vanessa Blake, reading the book, thought that she had no idea that in such simple words as Your Highness was hidden so much power. But at that moment, other girls ran up to her and asked Vanessa Blake if she wanted to try on outfits, because they had brought a lot of beautiful dresses. But she awkwardly said that she was busy reading, and so she would try on something later. And they only smiled happily, looking into the face of the protagonist, and thanked her for making their lives much more comfortable. But at that moment, she was approached by Princess Seraphima, who said that she shouldn't have said something like that earlier and apologized and ran away. And the protagonist only looked at her kindly and seemed to hold no grudge at all as she realized that this girl was in a completely different position. And she had no memory of 29 lives. And so she really valued her country. At about the same time, the tailor was preparing an image for His Highness, and wondered whether the man was sure of his choice, for his request was very interesting. But Duke Isaac calmly looked at the man and said that he must have misunderstood or misheard his orders, for he had ordered that the suit be made for him exactly as the emperor wears. Then the man stood in front of the mirror while the insanely frightened tailor continued to take his measurements. And then the man began to feed on his fear, and thought that these emotions were really disgusting tastes that annoyed him immensely. Then his gaze sharpened, and he remembered the main character and stated that no one could replace this little girl, and it would be no fun if he could enjoy her just once. And then smilingly thought that such a pleasure from a delicious meal should have been stretched as long as possible. In the end, at the same time, the knights who were away from training were talking about the recent rumors that His Highness had danced with a girl at the celebration. And then another knight, who was madly surprised, asked how it was possible because their lord had never danced with anyone before. But afterwards they suggested that perhaps their master had fallen in love with this girl at first sight, and she had really caught his eye. But after looking at the young man, they admitted that such a thing was hardly possible. Well, the next moment they noticed Erkin, who looked at them unhappily and asked why they were looking at him so attentively. And they only inquired if he had seen the girl who danced with His Highness and how he could describe her. But the man only calmly informed them that knights, instead of thinking of such a disgrace, would be better off practicing with swords. The knights were madly displeased with this answer. And then they began to reflect on the fact that the man had given his first dance to a girl from an invaded country, and it seemed to all of them that this girl was not at all suitable for his status. But afterwards, one of them said that it did not matter at all, because their lord had only had a passing fancy. And the man himself was thinking that perhaps he should have married this girl. And when his knights heard of this, they cried out in horror. Then they began to think that someone should have stopped His Highness, but none of them dared, because they could easily die by his hand for contradicting his wishes. And at this point, His Highness's crony reported that earlier the knights had asked what kind of man the Duke was, but they only said that they knew the story that an artist had drawn the map. And Duke Isaac threw a dart at the map and ordered the artist to erase the country he'd fallen into. That's the kind of man he was, which is why if the knights wanted to live, they had to dutifully agree with His Highness on everything. Then they started arguing about how long before the girl who dared to dance with him would die. And they all bet that the girl would probably die on our wedding night. And others bet their monthly paycheck that this girl would die before the wedding. But at that moment, the disgruntled man ran after them with his sword and told his subordinates that they were just idiots and should have watched what they were talking about, because it was as stupid and inappropriate as possible. But the next moment, the young man noticed the pensive fellow sitting there and asked him what he was doing. And he said that he would like to accompany a man who was stronger than he was, and therefore he hoped that the next duchess would be stronger. And the young man himself just wondered if the guy knew what he was talking about, because often knights were divided into 5 levels. The group of celestial knights were the highest elite, followed by the group of white knights, the most noble knights. After that, the common knights, the mercenary knights, the lone knights, and those who couldn't become knights. And in the past, there was also a group of black knights with a very bad reputation, so they were let go, and currently the strongest of the group is the heavenly knights, and all of them are mentors for the other knights. And this guy was one of the top 5 strongest sky knights. So the boy realized that it was foolish to hope that he could ever serve a duchess who was stronger than he was. After all, that girl had probably never even held a sword. She looks insanely confident, though. But at that moment, the man stood up and said that if the future duchess defeats at least one of these knights, he will recognize that she is strong. Not quite a guy just yelled at him and told him not to do anything stupid and go back to training. At about the same time, another demoness descended to the ground to eat a young man that in horror shook and looked at his defeated comrades that burned in the fire. And she only tasted his fear and said that it was insanely unpalatable, and then returned to the demon castle. And only with a bored look reported that this world was insanely boring. It was Ravia, Demona aristocrat who was in charge of sexual attraction.